Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into shipping choke points 101, Suez, Hormuz, Bab el-Mandeb, Panama. Here's the quick roadmap for what you'll get in this video. We're going to see how a handful of narrow passages can shake the entire world economy, why a short detour on a map becomes a long detour on your grocery bill, and how prices, insurance, and incentives quietly decide whether ships move or sit. By the end, you'll be able to look at a headline about a canal, a strait, or a missile attack and predict which costs will go up first, who pays them, and how long the shock might last. Now, let's set the stage. Picture the world's oceans as a vast highway system. Most of the time, traffic flows smoothly because the highway is enormous. But then you reach a toll booth that squeezes 8 lanes into 2. That toll booth is a choke point. It doesn't matter how fast you were going before, if that narrow passage slows down, everyone behind you slows down too. In shipping, a narrow passage is often a strait or a canal. The surprising truth is that a small geographic pinch can become a global economic lever. Consider the Suez Canal. It's just one waterway, but it typically carries about 10% of all world maritime trade and roughly 22% of containerized trade. Think about that for a second. Almost a quarter of the boxes holding clothes, electronics, parts, and everything in between, threaded through one canal. When that artery constricts, even a little, the pressure shoots outward along supply chains you and I rarely see. Why does this concentration matter so much? Because modern trade is optimized for speed and predictability. Car factories don't hold months of spare parts, they rely on just-in-time deliveries. Supermarkets refill shelves based on tight logistics rhythms. When a choke point hiccups, those rhythms miss a beat. A queue forms, ships idle, schedules slip, and suddenly entire industries are renegotiating time. And in logistics, time is not just money, it's inventory, it's interest costs, it's contract penalties, it's the difference between a full shelf and an empty one. Now add energy to the picture. Several choke points carry a significant share of the world's seaborne oil and gas. Energy flows are like the blood pressure of the global economy. If a strait that handles a big slice of crude or liquefied natural gas becomes risky, insurers raise premiums, shipowners ask for higher rates, and refiners start calculating Plan B. Those costs don't vanish, they transmit through fuel prices, freight rates, and eventually consumer prices. You might not see the choke point surcharge on a receipt, but when shipping gets more expensive, everything that depends on shipping quietly gets pricier too. Recent years have given us a living laboratory. We've watched Red Sea attacks discourage transits and push ships to take the long way around Africa. We've seen Panama face a harsh drought that lowered lake levels and forced the Canal Authority to cut daily transit slots and tighten draft rules. The lesson here isn't that the world is falling apart, it's that when 2 or 3 choke points are stressed at once, the system has fewer ways to flex. The reroutes are days. The added days add fuel. The added fuel adds cost. And the added cost, well, that compounds. Let's translate that into something concrete. Imagine a container ship scheduled to go from Asia to Europe through Suez. A credible threat in the Red Sea nudges the captain and the insurer to choose the Cape of Good Hope instead. That single decision can add more than a week to the voyage. Multiply that by dozens of vessels on similar routes, and suddenly there's a shortage of available ships where schedules expected them to be. Charter rates rise because more ships are tied up for longer. That ripples to freight rates for shippers, which ripple to the sticker prices for importers, which ripple to what you and I eventually pay. One small bend on the map becomes a large bend in the cost curve. So what exactly makes choke points such powerful risk nodes? 3 things. First, concentration. High volumes in a small space mean tiny interruptions have outsized effects. Second, substitution limits. The alternatives are not perfect substitutes. There is no second Suez next door, the detour is truly longer. Third, financial transmission. Insurance markets and freight contracts react immediately. The moment risk goes up, prices and terms change, and those changes broadcast the disruption around the world at the speed of credit, not the speed of a ship. You'll also notice that choke points are never just geography. They sit inside systems, legal systems that define passage rights, monetary systems that price risk, and governance systems that set rules on tolls, drafts, and bookings. When water levels fall or threats rise, authorities adjust rules to ration scarce capacity. That can be efficient in the moment, and yet, it also reshapes incentives. Who pays for priority? Who waits? Who can't afford the gamble? Every rule sends a signal, and those signals teach carriers and cargo owners how to behave next time. Here's the big takeaway for this opening slide. Choke points matter because they convert small physical constraints into large economic consequences. They concentrate trade, energy, and insurance in spaces where a single stuck ship, a single policy change, or a single week of bad weather can reprice time for half the planet. If you want to understand the next shipping headline, don't just ask what happened. Ask, how will this change distance, time, and risk pricing, and who has the flexibility to adapt? In the slides ahead, we'll keep this causal logic front and center. But for now, hold on to the core chain: narrow passage, concentrated volume, rising risk, longer routes, higher ton miles, and prices that quietly migrate from ship ledgers to household budgets. That's why choke points matter. Think of a canal or a strait like a shortcut through a mountain. The rock is real, but the way we move through it is designed. Geography provides the doorway, institutions decide who gets the key, what it costs, and how long you can stay inside. In other words, physical shortcuts only work because legal and monetary systems make them usable. And those systems create incentives that ripple far beyond the shoreline. Let's start with Suez. The canal opened in 1869 as a grand engineering bet that time itself could be shortened. For decades it was run under concessionary arrangements that reflected the power politics of the era. Then, in 1956, Egypt nationalized the canal. Pause on what that means in systems terms. Nationalization wasn't just a flag change, it switched the incentive controller. Pricing, priority, and enforcement now ran through an Egyptian state authority with its own budget needs, security concerns, and diplomatic calculus. In a world of concentrated traffic, that change in who writes the rules changes how ships behave, how insurers price risk, and how governments plan contingencies. The canal became not only a trench in the desert, but a lever of state policy. Now pivot to Panama. Built under American control in the early 20th century, it was governed for most of the century as a U.S. strategic asset. The Torrijos-Carter treaties in 1977 set a path for a full handover to Panama by 1999. Again, the deeper story is incentives. After the handover, the Panama Canal Authority could align operational rules and toll structures with Panama's own objectives, including modernization and financial sustainability. When a canal's owner can update locks, calibrate tolls by vessel class, and set booking frameworks that reward reliability and planning, the market begins to internalize those signals. Carriers learn that certain behaviors, like booking early, arriving within a narrow window, or meeting draft limits, reduce uncertainty and cost. Across both canals the pattern is the same. Governance choices act like a dashboard of policy levers. Tolls are not just fees, they are prices that ration scarce capacity. Priority booking isn't just a convenience, it is a queue management tool that encourages shippers to reveal how much they value time. Draft rules are not just technicalities, they are safety and water management constraints turned into economic rules of the game. Every lever shapes behavior. Raise tolls on certain vessel classes and you may push some traffic to alternative routes. Offer guaranteed transit windows at a premium and you attract time-sensitive cargo while nudging flexible cargo to wait. Tighten draft limits and you force cargo owners to lighten loads or switch ships, which echoes through charter markets and inventory plans. What makes these levers powerful is the way they translate physical scarcity into monetary trade-offs. A canal has a finite number of daily slots and a finite amount of water or security tolerance to support them. Rather than allocate those slots by first-come, first-served chaos, canal authorities use prices, reservations, and technical rules to meter flow. That metering is not arbitrary. It's a design choice about fairness, safety, and revenue, and it sends a signal to millions of downstream decisions. A shipper deciding between Suez and the Cape, or Panama and a rail bridge, is essentially comparing institutional terms, not just nautical miles. Law underpins all of this. Treaties, national statutes, and canal regulations define passage rights and dispute mechanisms. The difference between a canal guaranteed by a treaty framework and a canal governed by shifting decree is not academic, it changes insurers' assumptions, banks' lending terms, and captains' risk tolerances. When the rules are clear and predictable, capital shows up to invest in schedules and service frequency. When rules are opaque or politicized, capital adds a risk premium, and that premium gets baked into freight rates. Geography is fixed, but the cost of using geography is made by law. Money closes the loop. Tolls and fees flow into canal budgets, which fund maintenance, dredging, and upgrades. Those investments expand safe capacity and reduce uncertainty, which lowers the risk premium, which can justify different pricing, which then shapes route choices again. It's a feedback system. Legal authority sets rules, rules set prices, prices guide behavior, behavior affects congestion and safety, and those outcomes either validate the rules or force a redesign. Good canal governance is not just about collecting revenue, it's about continuously tuning a machine so that the next ship, and the thousand after it, can predict their journey with confidence. This is why two canals carved by different empires evolved into different institutional ecosystems. Suez's nationalization placed a strategic corridor under a regional sovereign with complex security realities. Panama's late-century handover created a commercially focused authority that could experiment with pricing models and booking systems. Neither path is automatic triumph or failure. The lesson is subtler. When the gatekeepers design clear, credible rules that track the true scarcities, time, safety, water, they make the shortcut more valuable. When the rules diverge from those realities, the shortcut becomes a bottleneck with a price tag. So, as we move forward, keep this mental model in view. Geography creates the possibility. Institutions turn that possibility into a schedule and a price. And the exact settings on that institutional dashboard, tolls, priority, drafts, teach carriers how to behave the next time a horizon darkens. If you can read those settings, you can often forecast not just who will move first, but how the entire network will flex when stressed. Let's put Suez under the microscope, not as a line on a map, but as a machine that's been stress-tested again and again. Each shock reveals what really governs the flow of global trade, incentives, bottlenecks, and the speed at which risk turns into cost. Start with 1956. Egypt nationalizes the canal. On paper, that's a legal transfer. In practice, it flips the control panel. Tolls, access, and enforcement now reflect Egyptian state priorities. The world discovers that a canal is more than sand and water, it's a policy instrument. The immediate result is crisis and a closure, but the deeper result is a permanent recalibration of expectations. Insurers rewrite their assumptions. Navies take notes. Shipowners learn that a single sovereign decision can move entire fleets thousands of miles. Then, 1967 to 1975. The canal closes for 8 long years after the Six-Day War, and the Yellow Fleet is trapped mid-passage. 14 ships, crews improvising a tiny floating society, even issuing their own postal marks, an eerie reminder that when a choke point freezes, time doesn't just stop, it accumulates. Think about the economic translation of that. Every day of closure lengthens voyages around the Cape of Good Hope, ties up hulls, burns extra fuel, and pushes schedules from weekly to whenever we get there. Manufacturers pad inventory or accept stockouts. Ports at the end of the chain swing between idle time and sudden surges. The map did not change, but the cost of distance did. Fast forward to 2021. One ship, the Ever Given, wedged diagonally in the canal. 6 days of blockage. Roughly 422 ships in a queue that becomes a floating spreadsheet of the world economy, containers waiting on parts, tankers waiting on delivery windows, bulkers waiting on berths. What's the lesson? The canal's throughput is like an airport runway. If a single jet gets stuck, arrivals don't just pause, they stack. Salvage crews dredge, tugs heave, and when the channel reopens, the backlog doesn't vanish. It converts into lumpy arrivals downstream. Some schedules recover quickly, others pay weeks of knock-on delay. Again, the canal teaches the same sentence in a new dialect: small place, large consequence. Now the present stress test, beginning in late 2023 and persisting through 2025. Red Sea attacks cast a shadow over the approach to Suez. For many carriers, the expected value of risk flips the decision. Safer to take the Cape of Good Hope than to gamble with war risk, crew safety, and insurance terms. Traffic through Suez drops sharply. Cape route surge. Egypt's canal receipts suffer. And the system exhibits a familiar adaptation pattern: longer voyages, higher ton miles, tighter vessel supply, and steeper charter and freight rates. Notice the speed here. The threat is local, but the repricing is global. Markets transmit the shock faster than ships can sail away from it. There is, however, a partial safety valve for crude, the assumed pipeline across Egypt. When the canal is risky for heavily laden tankers, some flows can shift to pipe from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean and rejoin the sea there. It's not a perfect substitute, it has capacity limits, operational constraints, and it doesn't move everything, but it illustrates how systems grow parallel pathways after big shocks. The world learns, it builds redundancy, and that redundancy buys time the next time. What do these episodes have in common? Each reveals a different lever on the same mechanism. In 1956, the lever is sovereignty. In 1967, its geopolitics extended in time. In 2021, its operational fragility. In the Red Sea crisis, its security risk and insurance. And in all cases, the result is the same causal chain: a localized constraint becomes a global repricing of time. Suez is a stress test because it compresses geography and exposes governance. It asks, whenever trouble hits, who sets the rules, who absorbs the delay, and how quickly can alternative paths carry the load? So the enduring lesson is not just that Suez is vulnerable. It's that the world has built habits around its vulnerability: contingency contracts, routing playbooks, pipeline workarounds, and salvage capabilities measured in horsepower and hours. When you see the next Suez headline, translate it into that chain. How many days of delay? How many ships displaced? How much extra distance? And which prices will feel it first? If Suez is a shortcut for time, Hormuz is a dial for oil prices. It is the place where a local incident can whisper something into the ear of every gasoline pump on Earth. Why? Because on a typical recent year, roughly 20 to 21 million barrels per day pass through this single strait. That's about 1/5 of global petroleum liquids. When that much energy funnels through one narrow hinge, even small disturbances can act like a hand on the global thermostat. Think about how pricing works when so much volume depends on one passage. Traders don't wait to see whether ships arrive late, they price the probability that ships might arrive late. Insurers don't wait for confirmed damage, they price the probability of damage. Charterers and shipowners don't wait for a week of closures, they price the probability that a closure could happen on their watch. The result is a hazard premium that moves faster than the ships themselves. A rumor becomes a quote becomes a cost. And that cost shows up, quietly and relentlessly, in delivered prices downstream. History has already run this experiment. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, attacks on tankers turned commercial shipping into a frontline. The United States responded in 1987 with Operation Earnest Will, reflagging and escorting Kuwaiti tankers to keep oil flowing. Imagine what that signals to the market. On one hand, escorts reduce immediate risk for those convoys. On the other hand, the very need for escorts confirms that the corridor is contested. Insurers widen their risk bands. Some owners insist on higher day rates. Others refuse the voyage entirely. The flow continues, but the price of keeping it moving goes up, and the world learns a muscle memory: when Hormuz looks risky, at a premium. We saw a modern echo in 2019 with the tanker incidents near the Gulf of Oman. Damage to vessels, evacuations, dramatic images, none of it closed the strait, but all of it changed the math. Underwriters lifted war risk premiums from background noise to a line item you could see. Captains weighed not just the charted course but the electronic fog of spoofing and jamming. Owners and charterers recalculated what it would take to say yes to that route today, this week, this month. Even without a formal blockade, behavior shifted because the expected value of risk had changed. Notice the pattern. The physical channel is narrow, but the financial channels around it are wide and fast. Futures markets mark the new uncertainty. Insurers revise coverage and deductibles. Banks look again at counterparty risk. Every actor updates the same equation: probability of trouble times cost of trouble versus the price of alternative options. Sometimes the answer is to keep sailing and pay more. Sometimes the answer is to wait. Either way, the price signal travels at the speed of information, not at the speed of a laden tanker. Here is the practical takeaway for reading Hormuz headlines. Ask 3 questions. First, did the incident change actual capacity, or did it change perceived risk? Second, how are insurers responding today, not next week? Third, what are owners and charterers doing with fixtures and options right now? Those 3 answers usually tell you how quickly any premium will show up in delivered prices and how long it might linger once the immediate danger fades. Because markets remember. After every scare, some of that memory remains in contracts, contingency plans, and crew decisions. And that's why Hormuz is a pivot point. It doesn't just carry oil, it carries expectations. When expectations tilt toward danger, the world pays for it immediately. Not in speeches, but in cents per barrel, dollars per day, and choices about where to sail tomorrow. Picture the Red Sea as a long, narrow hallway leading to the Suez Canal. Bab el-Mandeb is the doorway at the bottom of that hallway. If the doorway gets crowded, or dangerous, the entire hallway becomes less useful, and everything beyond Suez feels the strain. Here is the core fact to keep in mind. In a normal recent year, this strait carries on the order of 8.5 million barrels per day of energy flows. During the Red Sea attacks, that average through the period into 2024 fell to around 4 million barrels per day. That's more than a simple dip. That is a structural choke, cutting flows by over half, and it forces a decision on every shipowner and cargo planner in the region. Do you sail through a threat corridor and pay higher war risk premiums, or do you detour around the Cape of Good Hope and pay in time, fuel, and tied-up capital? This is why Bab el-Mandeb matters even if you never see it on a map. It is the hinge between the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. Close the hinge, or make it risky, and ships that would have popped through to Suez now face a different arithmetic. The shorter route becomes the longer route. The predictable schedule becomes a variable. The "we'll be there on Thursday" becomes "we'll be there when we can sail around a continent." Security incidents have repeatedly reminded the market just how quickly that arithmetic changes. In 2016, missile attacks in the area forced warships to intercept and defend. In 2018, after very large crude carriers were attacked in nearby waters, a major exporter suspended shipments through the corridor. None of these episodes permanently shut the door, but all of them changed the expected value calculus. Owners and insurers ask the same questions every time. What's the probability of an incident on this specific passage? How would that incident affect crew safety and hull integrity? What is the revised price that makes the risk tolerable today? When enough actors answer those questions with caution, you get avoidance behavior. Avoidance migrates traffic south, around the Cape. That decision is rational at the ship level, but it multiplies system-wide costs. Sailing the long way adds days to the voyage. Days add fuel burn. Extra fuel and time tie up the vessel that could have been moving another cargo. Multiply by dozens or hundreds of voyages and suddenly the available fleet seems smaller, even if the number of ships has not changed. Charter rates rise to reflect the effective scarcity of time. Freight rates follow. The price signal then flows to importers and, eventually, to consumers who never heard the phrase Bab el-Mandeb in their lives. There is also a logistical rhythm problem that is easy to miss. Liner services and tanker rotations are built around tight schedules. When a corridor like this becomes risky, and half the flows peel off to the Cape, arrivals at destination ports stop behaving like a metronome and start behaving like a drum solo. You get bunching. You get gaps. Port operators swing from idle berths to sudden waves of ships, and that volatility itself becomes a cost, overtime, yard congestion, and missed rail connections inland. Notice how the mechanics echo what we saw with other choke points, but with its own twist. This strait is not only narrow, it is proximate to active conflict zones, which means the information environment is noisy and fast-moving. A single dramatic image or credible advisory can move insurance quotes by the afternoon. That speed matters. Prices change at the speed of information, while ships can only change course at the speed of a hull in water. The gap between those speeds is where costs accumulate. So, how do you read a Bab el-Mandeb headline in practical terms? Ask 3 quick questions. 1. Did the news affect actual capacity or primarily perception and insurance pricing? 2. Are cargo owners pausing or rebooking today, and are majors suspending specific routes? 3. How far are fixtures and schedules sliding toward the Cape option? If the answers point to even a partial shift around Africa, expect more days at sea, higher ton-miles, and a ripple of scarcity in available vessels on key trades. That scarcity is what shows up as higher rates days or weeks later, long after the headline has scrolled out of view. In short, Bab el-Mandeb is the gate to Suez, but it is also a switch that reconfigures global routes when flipped. When the switch tilts toward danger, the system pays immediately, not just in money, but in time, reliability, and the oxygen of modern commerce, predictable schedules. Panama is the rare canal where the most important commodity isn't cargo or time. It's fresh water. Every transit is a choreography of lakes, locks, and gravity. Open the gates, lift a ship up to Gaten Lake, lower it back down to sea level, and you have just spent a huge amount of fresh water that will never return. That is why, in Panama, water is policy. Here's the basic mechanics in plain language. The canal's locks raise ships from the Atlantic up to Gaten Lake, then lower them to the Pacific, or the other way around. Each lift and each drop uses lake water that ultimately drains into the ocean. In normal conditions, tropical rains refill the lake fast enough to support a high cadence of daily transits. But when rainfall falls short, lake levels drop. And when the lake drops, 2 things happen immediately. First, the canal must cut the number of daily slots to preserve the lake. Second, it must tighten draft limits so ships sit shallower in the water. Less water means fewer ships and lighter ships. That is exactly what we saw in the recent drought. Daily transits, which normally sit in the mid-30s, were cut to around 22 per day, then gradually eased to about 24 as the hydrology improved. Draft rules were adjusted to protect safety margins. None of that is arbitrary. Those numbers are the translation of lake level into economics, how many ships can pass, at what draft, without draining tomorrow's capacity to move anyone at all. Now let's talk incentives. When there are fewer lockages than ships that want them, someone has to go first and someone has to wait. The Canal Authority uses a reservation system with quotas and auctions to allocate priority. That sounds like paperwork until you see how it works in the real world. Time-sensitive cargoes, like certain container services, bid for guaranteed slots. Less time-sensitive cargoes may accept the queue. The price of a reservation is not just a fee, it is a signal that turns a physical scarcity, limited water and limited lockages, into a monetary trade-off that the market can process. This pricing and booking framework does two jobs at once. It rations today's scarce capacity toward the users who value it most right now, and it quietly changes behavior for tomorrow. Carriers that can plan far ahead book early. Services that can tolerate variability adjust schedules or routes. Bulk cargoes consider light loading or alternate paths. In other words, the rules don't just move ships, they teach ships how to move. The draft limits add another layer. If you must sail with a shallower draft, you either lighten your load, split your cargo across more voyages, or choose a different route. Each choice has a cost profile. Lighten the load and you pay in extra voyages or missed economies of scale. Split cargo and you tie up more vessels and crews. Reroute and you pay in time and fuel. The canal's technical rule about how deep a ship may sit becomes a strategic decision that echoes through charter markets, storage plans, and delivery promises. What about the system beyond Panama? The moment daily slots and draft tighten, you see spillovers. Some Asia to U.S. East Coast containers redivert to West Coast ports and move inland by rail. Some carriers pivot services through Suez when it makes sense for their network. Certain bulk and energy cargoes choose the long way around, accepting extra days at sea to avoid uncertainty. None of these moves are free, but they are rational responses to a clear signal: water is scarce, capacity is capped, plan accordingly. There's a deeper lesson here that's easy to miss. In a freshwater canal, the owner is not simply a toll collector. It is a water manager balancing today's traffic against tomorrow's lake. The reservation auctions, the quotas, the draft limits, these are not bureaucratic hoops. They are the canal's way of turning hydrology into a queue that the market can understand and a price that can be compared to alternatives. The result is not perfect efficiency, but it is a system where millions of downstream decisions can coordinate without a single central dispatcher telling each ship where to go. So when you hear that Panama cut transits or tightened draft, translate it immediately. It means the lake is low. It means priority will be priced. It means some cargo will move earlier, some will move lighter, and some will move elsewhere. And it means that for a while, the cost of distance on certain trades will quietly rise, paid not only in dollars, but in days. Route arbitrage sounds fancy, but the logic is simple. If the shortest path gets risky or congested, you take the longer path and see if the trade still works. The trick is that in shipping, time is not a detail. Time is the price of almost everything. When a carrier sends a ship around the Cape of Good Hope instead of through Suez, they are buying extra days at sea in exchange for less risk. Those days are paid for in fuel, crew, maintenance, and the most expensive line item of all, the use of a scarce vessel. Let's turn that into a clear picture. Imagine your service normally runs like a metronome. Asia to Europe, through Suez, arrive on schedule, reload, and repeat. Now a threat corridor appears and the same voyage takes many more days. The schedule does not just slide to the right. The whole loop stretches. The ship that would have been available for the next departure is still at sea. To keep weekly departures, a carrier may need to add another ship to the loop. If they cannot add a ship, the service becomes less frequent or less reliable. That is how a few extra days in geography become a form of scarcity in ships. This is why analysts watch ton miles. It is a simple measure. Multiply the tons you move by the miles you sail. A D2 that adds thousands of miles raises ton miles without changing the physical cargo. From the market's point of view, demand for shipping services just got larger, even if customers are ordering the same goods. Recent reroutings added a few % to global ton miles overall and increased effective container ship demand by something like double digits on key lanes. That is not a rounding error. It is the difference between a slack market and a tight one. Fuel magnifies the effect. A D2 that adds 10 to 15 days can turn a carefully budgeted bunker plan into a much bigger bill. Extra steaming time also means more engine hours and more maintenance sooner. None of this is catastrophic by itself. Added together across dozens of services, it becomes a higher floor under freight rates. Shippers then face a choice. Pay more for the same speed, accept slower transit times for a similar price, or shift the mix of what they move and when. Now look at time from the cargo owner's side. A slower route means cash tied up on the water. Inventory financing costs are small when counted per container. They are not small when counted across an entire supply chain. If a company depends on tight delivery windows, delays also carry contractual penalties and reputational risk. Some firms respond by building a little more stock. Others pull forward orders to compensate for longer voyages. Both responses move costs from the ocean to the warehouse. That is still a cost. There is another layer for European trades. Longer voyages change the emissions profile of each move. More steaming days mean more emissions. Under regimes that price carbon, those extra emissions can carry a direct cost. For carriers serving Europe, rerouting around Africa can increase the compliance bill they pay on top of fuel. That does not decide every routing choice, but it does tilt the arithmetic. One detail often missed is how speed management interacts with rerouting. Carriers can sail faster to claw back days, but fuel consumption rises sharply with speed. They can slow steam to save fuel, but then the schedule slips further. On long detours, the usual sweet spot for speed often shifts. A small change in knots can make or break the economics of a loop. That decision is taken voyage by voyage, week by week, based on bunker prices, slot bookings, and the value of keeping a promised arrival window. So how do you read the headline that says ships are avoiding Suez and taking the Cape option? Translate it into 3 practical consequences. First, more days at sea on major strings. Second, higher ton miles and a tighter effective supply of ships. Third, a cascade into rates, schedules, and inventory strategy on land. The numbers you will see in reports are just different ways of measuring these same mechanics. A few % more ton miles here. A jump in effective demand for vessels there. The pattern repeats whenever the short path stops being the smart path. In short, route arbitrage is the market's way of turning distance and danger into a price. If the risk-adjusted cost of the shortcut climbs, the long way becomes the new baseline. Time expands. Capacity tightens. And prices quietly teach everyone where the world's trade lanes actually run today, not where the atlas says they should. When a sea lane turns risky, the first thing that actually moves isn't a ship. It's a number on an underwriter's screen. Finance translates danger into dollars, and those dollars decide who sails, who waits, and who pays. Start with war risk premiums. Think of the annual hull policy as your regular health plan for a ship, and war risk as the sudden hazard rider you bolt on when a voyage crosses a listed danger zone. When incidents spike in the Red Sea, underwriters don't sermonize, they reprice. A typical jump to something like 0.7% to 1% of the vessel's insured hull value can appear almost overnight. Do the back of the envelope with me. If a tanker's insured value is $100 million, that implies an extra $700,000 to $1 million just to pass the corridor under the new conditions. Not for a year. For the exposure window connected to that transit, that single line item now has to be earned back in the freight rate. How does that become your shipping bill? Ship owners don't absorb that cost as a personal hobby. They allocate it across the cargo they carry. Tanker operators rework the time charter equivalent math. Container carriers introduce or enlarge a risk surcharge on boxes routed through the zone. Charterers, the customers who rent ships, fold that surcharge into what they quote to cargo owners. And cargo owners pass it along in the price of fuel, chemicals, parts, or produce. No one needs to announce this on the evening news. The cost just quietly migrates down the chain, as reliably as gravity pulls water downhill. Insurance also moves faster than steel. Underwriters can change quotes in hours, sometimes minutes, based on a new advisory or a credible incident. Ships cannot teleport, they need days to reroute. That timing gap matters. While hulls are still mid-ocean, the forward fixtures, those future bookings, start to reflect a world in which fewer owners are willing to say yes at yesterday's price. That's why freight rates can jump even before you see a visible drop in traffic. Finance has already discounted the new risk. Now bring in banks and charterers. Lenders look at the same corridor and revisit terms. They can tighten covenants on leverage and liquidity for owners heavily exposed to the risk area. They can widen margins on revolving credit facilities that fund working capital for bunkers and port fees. None of this is theatrical, it's spreadsheets and committee calls. But when credit tightens at the edges, some marginal owners step back from the trade rather than pay more for both risk and money. That decision shrinks the pool of available tonnage. Charterers add their own filters. Risk clauses in contracts get sharper. Some insist on deviation rights or alternative routing baked into the fixture. Others simply refuse to fix ships through the corridor during a hot period. If enough counterparties set those limits at once, you've effectively cordoned off a slice of the global fleet. Available ships on key lanes feel scarcer, not because they sank, but because legal and financial terms pulled them off the board. Scarcity lifts day rates, higher day rates validate the caution, the loop closes. Notice the through line. A localized security problem changes insurance math. The insurance math changes credit and contract terms. Those terms change behavior: who will sail, at what price, with what conditions. And behavior changes the market you and I can see, the rate on the route, the surcharge on the invoice, the delivery promise on the purchase order. It's the same cargo, on the same ocean, but the cost of permission to move has gone up. If you want to read these moments like an insider, watch 3 needles. 1. The war risk quote level for the corridor. 2. The stance of lenders and lessors toward owners with exposure. 3. The language in new fixtures. Do you see more protective clauses and rerouting options? When all 3 tilt tighter at the same time, expect fewer willing hulls, higher rates, and a noticeable premium in anything that depends on that lane. In maritime trade, risk doesn't just travel with the ship. It travels ahead of it, priced into the very decision to leave port. When the map tilts, the market does not wait for a memo. It adapts. Not perfectly, not without cost, but fast enough to keep the arteries of trade from freezing. Think of it like a convoy that suddenly meets a roadblock. No one can move the obstacle today. So they reshuffle the order of the trucks, open a side lane, and radio ahead to adjust the schedule at the next depot. That is what carriers and cargo owners do when choke points squeeze. Start with the carriers. A scheduled service is a loop of ships that must hit weekly windows. If a detour stretches the loop, the carrier faces a choice. Let the service slip, or add one more ship so the loop can still produce a weekly departure. In recent disruptions, you could see new hulls pulled from secondary routes and inserted into the stretched loops to keep the rhythm. That choice is expensive because every ship tied to one loop is a ship that cannot be used elsewhere. Yet it stabilizes the product that customers rely on. Weekly departures continue, fewer cancellations. The price is higher, but the schedule remains intelligible. Speed management is the next lever. If reliability is the priority, a carrier may sail a little faster on one leg and slow slightly on another to hit a crucial arrival window. Small changes in speed across a fleet add up to a large change in predictability. The goal is not to run every ship at maximum power. The goal is to hit the advertised berthing windows often enough that ports and rail connections can plan around them. When the ocean is volatile, clockwork becomes a competitive advantage. Network design also flexes. Alliances and vessel-sharing agreements allow carriers to swap slots or co-load on overlapping services. That is a way to redeploy capacity without owning every hull on the loop. A carrier can place some customers onto a partner's ship on a nearby string, then return the favor elsewhere. The customer sees a box moving. Behind the scenes, the network is shuffling seats on the same airplane, so to speak, to keep more flights on time. Now look at the cargo owners. The first reflex is mode shift. Time-sensitive freight that would normally sail all water may move by sea to a west coast or Gulf port and then by rail. In extreme cases, a portion of the most urgent cargo will fly. That is expensive, so it is used like a scalpel, not a hammer. A second reflex is rescheduling. Orders are pulled forward. Shipments are consolidated to fill guaranteed slots. Less urgent cargo is pushed to a later sailing. The point is to reduce the number of surprises by making a few deliberate changes up front. Inventory strategy changes as well. Some firms raise safety stock for components that now spend more days at sea. Others delay committing to final product configuration until the goods land, also known as postponement. Both tactics convert transport uncertainty into a different kind of cost that can be planned. Warehouses carry a little more. Factories sequence production with more slack on the inputs that cross the risky corridor. Financial teams rewrite the cash flow timing so that inventory in transit does not break the quarter. Contracts and pricing respond quickly. Carriers publish temporary surcharges that reflect the extra fuel, the longer voyage, and the war risk premiums where relevant. Large shippers negotiate index-linked or volume-protected agreements so that a minimum number of boxes move even in a tight week. Smaller shippers shift bookings toward forwarders who can assemble enough volume to buy space more reliably. It is not elegant, but it aligns incentives. The customers who most value certainty signal that value through the rates and the terms they accept. Ports and inland nodes adapt too. When arrivals bunch after long detours, terminals adjust labor plans and yard strategy. Some ports become relays. Containers land at one hub, shift to a feeder ship, and then move to the original destination on a later tide. On tanker and bulker trades you can see floating storage rise for a time, which evens out refinery runs and loading windows. These are stopgaps. They buy breathing room so that the next week is a little smoother than the last. None of this eliminates the cost of disruption. It spreads it and sequences it so that no single point absorbs the full hit. Decentralized decisions, guided by prices and contracts, create a patchwork of small fixes. Add one ship to a loop. Trim or add a knot of speed. Reroute a service for a month. Shift 10% of a product line to a different port pair. Hold an extra week of inventory on a critical component. Each move looks modest on its own. Together they form a buffer that prevents a corridor problem from becoming a systemic failure. If you want to read these adaptations in real time, watch for a few tells. Added ships on stretched loops. Fewer blank sailings on the most valuable strings. Temporary surcharges that rise, then plateau. A small uptick in air freight on the lanes most exposed to delay. Port throughput that looks choppy for a month, followed by a gradual return to a steadier beat. These are the fingerprints of a market that is not waiting to be rescued. It is rescuing itself, one decision at a time. Let's talk about the levers in the control room. Tolls, draft limits, reservation caps. On paper these look like neat, technical fixes. In practice, they are powerful nudges that change where ships go, when they go, and how entire networks evolve after the crisis fades. Centralized rules can ration pain quickly. They can also redraw habits that last long after the headline is gone. Start with tolls. When a canal authority raises rates or layers on surcharges to manage congestion or fund resilience, it is sending a price signal. This path just got more expensive relative to the alternatives. In the short run, that's efficient. Scarce slots should flow to cargo that values them most. But the long run is sneakier. If the surcharge sticks around too long, or if it is adjusted unpredictably, planners begin to treat the canal not as the default, but as a premium option. Network maps change color. A detour that began as an emergency becomes a new baseline on certain strings because it's simpler to plan for a slightly longer, more predictable route than to gamble on a rule set that might change mid-voyage. Draft limits work the same kind of alchemy. Tighten the allowable draft to protect safety and water levels, and you immediately push some ships to lighten loads or split sailings. That's rational. But repeat that pattern over a season, and charterers start contracting for different hull sizes, different stowage plans, even different ports of call. The fleet composition deployed to those trades drifts. Once owners reposition assets to fit the new normal, they don't snap back the moment the lake refills or the crisis cools. There's friction. There are leases, long-term service commitments, and the simple desire to avoid whiplash. Yesterday's temporary rule becomes tomorrow's design constraint. Reservation caps and priority booking are another classic trade-off. Caps prevent a few big players from crowding out everyone else when capacity tightens. Priority products, sold at a premium, funnel scarce slots to time-sensitive cargo. That's queue management done with prices instead of elbows. But the unintended outcome can be a two-tier ecosystem. Large shippers rewrite contracts to guarantee space at almost any cost, while smaller players shift toward forwarders or alternative gateways because the pay-for-certainty lane no longer fits their economics. Over time, that bifurcation changes who serves which ports, which inland corridors get reinforced, and where inventory buffers have to live. Now zoom out to the evidence we've been circling. Prolonged risk in the approaches to Suez, missiles, drones, and the insurance math that follows, pushed a meaningful share of Asia-Europe services around the Cape of Good Hope. At first it was a detour. Then carriers added ships to stretched loops, ports adjusted labor to meet bunched arrivals, and customers rewrote delivery promises. Even as some risk eased at moments, those newly built routines didn't vanish overnight. Habits harden. The fleet you can actually mobilize on any given week reflects decisions made months ago in response to rule and risk. The Panama drought tells a parallel story. Daily transit caps and stricter drafts were the correct tools to protect the lake. Short run, they worked. The canal preserved a core flow while hydrology recovered. Long run, they taught the market that water scarcity can and will be priced into the queue. Carriers shifted some services to rail-land bridge combinations. Bulk and energy cargoes accepted longer sea legs on certain lanes. Even after rains returned and slots rose, not every ship came straight back. Some services had already been re-optimized. The network remembered the cost of uncertainty and kept a little distance built in. Here's the quiet principle tying these cases together. Centralized fixes are fastest at allocating today's scarcity, but they also create tomorrow's path dependence. Price a corridor like a luxury lane for long enough and planners will design networks that can thrive without it. Tighten a draft repeatedly and owners will place different ships on that trade. Cap reservations through a crunch and customers will retool contracts and inventory so they never depend on a single gatekeeper again. None of this is defiance. It's adaptation. So what's the trade-off in plain speech? Central control can align safety and order under stress, and that's valuable. Yet every rule teaches the market a lesson about where risk lives and who pays for it. If the lessons stack up as unpredictability, the market rewrites the map to avoid being taught the same lesson twice. If the lessons stack up as credible, transparent signals tied to the real scarcities, time, water, safety, then the shortcut retains its centrality because users can plan around it. The difference between those two outcomes is not geography. It's governance, incentives, and memory. Let's step back and tie the strands together. We began with a simple idea: a narrow place can turn distance into time, and time into price. Along the way we saw how canals and straits are not just geography, they are rule sets. Tolls, drafts, queues, war risk quotes, and credit terms are the vocabulary through which the world decides who moves first, who waits, and who pays. Here is the core pattern to carry with you. A local constraint raises perceived risk. Finance translates that risk into numbers. Those numbers alter behavior before steel ever changes course. Detours follow, ton miles rise, vessels feel scarce, and prices ripple outward into factories, stores, and family budgets. Then, as authorities respond with centralized fixes, the market learns new habits that can persist long after the crisis cools. Geography is the stage. Incentives are the plot. Now the moral questions that history keeps asking. When a handful of corridors price the world's essentials, who absorbs the shocks first, the big shipper with room in the budget, or the small importer feeding a city far from deep water? What happens to crews when war risk math says yes but prudence says no? When policy choices ration scarce water or security, do they protect the commons or shift fragility onto neighbors with fewer options? And if the lesson the market learns is unpredictability, does that nudge planners toward longer, costlier routes that quietly tax the poor through higher delivered prices? There are practical takeaways too. If you want a resilient system, build a portfolio, not a single point of failure. Redundancy matters: parallel routes, pipelines, rail and land bridges, and the boring work of maintenance that prevent small problems from becoming grand crises. Transparency matters: clear, predictable rules that price the scarcities we actually face: time, water, safety, so carriers can plan and insurers can price without rumor filling the gap. And freedom of navigation matters, not as a slogan, but as a lived discipline that reduces the temptation to use trade arteries as levers of coercion. When the next headline breaks, try this quick lens. What changed the distance or the time? Is the insurance and credit language signaling a real capacity loss or a temporary fear premium? Who in this network can adapt fastest, and who is stuck paying for everyone else's data? The answers won't make the shock painless, but they will keep you from being surprised by the shape of the costs. Thank you for spending this time thinking with me. If you enjoy this kind of thoughtful, evidence-driven history, I'd love your support. Please like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps more people find the channel. And if you want to go deeper, check out my book History They Tried to Erase in the description. I post new episodes that mix storytelling with rigorous sources, so explore the channel and queue up another video. Until next time, keep your maps handy and your questions sharper than your roots.